Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever completely virtual Arab Film Fest Collab. Thank you for joining us for this talk, which we're very excited to present. The organizers of the AFFC, the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, the Arab Film and Media Institute, based in San Francisco, California, RT East in New York, and MISNA, based in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota, are thrilled to bring you a conversation with one of the most creative and prominent Palestinian filmmakers, Larissa Sansour. If you haven't already, be sure to check out her incredible retrospective available on our festival for the entire duration of the festival. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our guests, Larissa and Kareem, who will participate in today's conversation. The first and foremost is filmmaker and artist Larissa Sansour. Central to her work is the tug and pull between fiction and reality. In her recent works, she uses science fiction to address social and political issues. Working mainly with film, Sansour also produces installation, photos, and sculptures. Sansour's work is shown or has shown in festivals and museums worldwide. In 2019, she represented Denmark at the 58th Venice Biennale. She has shown her work at Tate Modern, MoMA, Centre Pompidou, and the Istanbul Biennale, as well as Berlinale, Rotterdam International Film Festival, and BFI London Film Festival. Recent solo exhibitions of hers include Blue Coat in Liverpool, Dar Nimmer in Beirut, and Nikolai Kunsthal in Copenhagen. Sansour lives and works in London as well. And also joining us to discuss Sansour's work is Kareem Stefan. Kareem is an arts writer, editor, and PhD candidate in modern culture and media at Brown University, writing a dissertation on witnessing and world building in Palestinian visual culture. His essays, reviews, and writings have appeared in 4 columns: Art in America, Frieze, Ibraz, Journal of Palestine Studies, The New Inquiry, and Third Text, among others. Kareem is co-editor of Assuming Boycott, Resistance, Agency, and Cultural Production, an anthology of essays on cultural boycotts, transnational solidarities, and self-censorship in the arts. I'd also like to thank Jordan Lee Thompson, our tech behind the scenes. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I'll let you get to it. I'm super excited about this.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you so much, Larissa, for speaking with our audience. I want to begin by mentioning that the program that our viewers have seen features 3 videos that have become known as your sci-fi trilogy: A Space Exodus, made in 2008, Nation Estate, made in 2012, and In the Future, They Ate from the Finest Porcelain, made in 2015. It also features your most recent film, In Vitro, which continues to explore central themes of your work like memory, identity, narrative, and nationalism, also through sci-fi. So I'd like to ask you if you could reflect on the progression of your films over the course of a decade. When you look back to A Space Exodus, what first drew you to science fiction? What do you think turning to sci-fi opened up for you, and what do you feel has changed for you, if anything, since then?
I think I started working with the moving image in 2002, and I think back then it was around the time with the Siege of Bethlehem, where most of, or some members of my family were still living, but I was already living abroad. I grew up in Palestine, I grew up in Bethlehem, and I was born in Jerusalem. And I think when I first left home, it became very clear that I constantly am negotiating between the reality that I came from and the reality that I find myself in. And that was after years and years of living abroad. So my Palestinian identity was constantly something that I couldn't shake off. And so I became interested in how our culture was slowly disappearing. Whatever I remembered of Palestine didn't exist anymore. And this is becoming more and more dramatic now. But around 2002, I think it was the Siege of Bethlehem. And whatever reports I would learn from, say, BBC or CNN was completely different from what my family and friends were telling me there. And therefore, my interest in documentary or showing a completely different view or was very important. So I would say I was working with more documentary based work back then. For example, there is a work where I show a peace activist in front of an Israeli tank trying to stop an Israeli tank from entering a village. And so that was very straightforward and very kind of trying to show a different angle of war that we don't usually get from news reporting. But also I tried to document my friends, family, and also the city of Bethlehem that I come from. And it felt at that point that we don't know if these places will stay. I don't know if it almost was kind of therapeutic for me to actually have this visual document that I actually, even if they don't exist anymore, that they existed once, and I did exist in that context. In that historical moment. But then the more I worked with documentary, the more I found that the audience response, especially in the places I lived in America or in Europe, was I think either that it was too shocking to believe that whatever I'm showing is actually happening in what is presumed to be the only functioning democracy in the Middle East, which is Israel. And therefore I became almost a person who's spreading propaganda, because people did not really believe that these violations existed. And so I didn't want to be in that position where I always had to defend the reality, even if it was stranger than fiction. I thought that working with fiction would be even more honest in my situation. I didn't want to be dictated by the current political jargon. I wanted to create my own language and my own world building, and sci-fi really allowed me to start working like this. And so with the first, I would say, sci-fi film I ever kind of worked on was Space Exodus in 2009, I would think. And it features me as the first Palestinian woman landing on the moon. And therefore it kind of references the American moon landing. And also it references Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey. So there's a whole segment from A Space Odyssey that's been rearranged to have more of an Arabic score. Also, there are a lot of feminist kind of undertones to the films, with starting from me being the protagonist to the spacesuit having a completely different styling with the boots, and so that was my own take on a space landing, and with that a lot of other kind of there are many layers in that film, speaking of colonialism to the loss of my own land, being born in Jerusalem and not being able to get to Jerusalem nowadays. So sci-fi became kind of almost the unlikely kind of choice for a Palestinian condition, and somehow it's more and more is playing a very important role in most of my work.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is I think we're also seeing it in other Palestinian cultural works more and more too. Last year, for example, there was an anthology of writers imagining Palestine in 2048 that came out. There's a lovely novel by Ibtisam Azam that imagines that all of the Palestinians in historic Palestine have disappeared overnight. So you spoke very eloquently to why you turned to sci-fi with A Space Exodus after having done documentary work at a very intense moment in Palestinian history, the Second Intifada, and the sieges of Bethlehem, of Jenin, of Ramallah that were happening around 2002. A Space Exodus was now 10, 12 years ago. I wonder what you sort of learned through working in science fiction, and also maybe if you want to speak to the changes in, let's say, narrative, in the sense that A Space Exodus was a very short film with a few words from you as the astronaut, but no dialogue per se. And we've arrived now with In Vitro to a remarkably acted film with a very sharp and finely written dialogue. So what are some of the changes over the last decade as you worked in this mode?
Yeah, it's true. There are many changes. And I think when I first started working with science fiction, it was mostly the gesture that mattered, the fact that it was, how do we frame the Palestinian dialogue in something completely different? And that the gesture was the most important aspect of that, and the act of kind of claiming power, or saying, I don't want to be part of a documentary where I'm the analyzed and save the analyzing for progressive countries. I want to be the one who is actually uses universal language, because I have the right, as many do, to actually claim that language or that space for myself as well. I mean, the sci-fi is very white, very male, and therefore it's subverting that form by me insisting on being, a Palestinian woman. I mean, even an artist who usually, I would be boxed in with people who work with counter mainstream tools, and I wanted to kind of counteract that by saying that, well, as an artist as well, I am going to use those tools to kind of to my own end. So in that sense, a lot of what I kind of do is shift context, shift even when I'm working with sculpture, I shift the context of that sculpture from, say, film to real life, from fiction to fiction and real. All these blurring of those categories is quite central to my work, and I think these were the kind of the elements that I concentrated on in A Space Exodus. You can almost see it as an iconic statement of all these issues. Whereas the more I worked with science fiction, the more, and moving image in general, the more the universes I started building became quite elaborate, and the dialogues between the protagonists became more elaborate, and I got kind of fascinated by this, the many kind of dialectics you can have between the many elements that go into the making of sci-fi. So I feel it's becoming more complex and more demanding to work in that way, and obviously also more costly, because Space Exodus back then seemed like a very big project for me, but now it seems like a very kind of contained, nice little project.
So I'm glad you mentioned the many shifting contexts that you work in, and speak about using sci-fi as an artist, because we're speaking in the context of a film festival right now, but maybe some viewers are not aware that you also have an artistic practice that includes sculpture and photography. And Ahmed in his introduction mentioned that In Vitro premiered at the Venice Biennale last year. It was together with a sculpture called Monument for Lost Time. And each of your projects has been presented as a video installation in galleries and in museums. So maybe you could describe Monument for Lost Time briefly for the audience, and the experience that you wanted to create in pairing that sculpture with the video in vitro, and more generally, what it means to you to display your work a certain way in galleries or in museums, and then have it watched in a different way in film theaters or online in screenings like this.
Yeah, I mean, I come from an art background, so the fact that I work with moving image is incidental in the sense that I actually can manifest whatever concepts I have in whichever form is needed, but I often find the moving image to be the best in combining, say, sound, dialogue, visuals. So it's very easy for me to work like this. The sphere in the Venice Biennale is based on the sphere that you see in the film In Vitro, which is the last film I made in 2019. In the film, the sphere functions as a kind of ephemeral object, or more like a repository of memory and the main protagonist's negotiation between her past and future, and a lot of other traumas. Whereas when you take that object and you situate it in a different context, such as the Danish pavilion in Venice, it becomes something completely different. And you have to have a justification for why you took that object out of a film. That object in the film is completely CGI, so the actors interacted with nothing, whereas in Venice, it's has a looming presence. It's 5 meters in diameter. It was an engineering feat. It had a whole team working on it because it's made out of steel structurally, and then coated with plexiglass, and then sprayed with the darkest, the blackest of blacks. So it has a big presence. Its idea of it was that it should function as a black hole where it sucks all matter. And when you see it, you get confused in the pavilion because you don't know if it's a disc or if it's actually a 3D object, because it's painted with the blackest of black so as not to reflect light, so as to play with your notion of dimensionality. And that is done on purpose to kind of basically address this idea that is in the film when the two protagonists talk about the black holes and their significance and what that means. But it only started making sense when it became a monument rather than an object in a film. And then when it was called Monument for Lost Time, it immediately kind of became this signifier of nothing, which is also quite an oxymoron. That is a signifier, but it signifies nothing. And this play between the film and the actual space is something that very much interests me. It is something that I played with before in a work I made in 2016 called In the Future, They Ate from the Finest Porcelain, where objects from the film then kind of are actualized in a completely different performance in real life. So it's that, I think that tension between them is what I find quite interesting.
Yeah, and you also rework symbols even between works sometimes. I mean, mentioning the porcelain in the future, you know, we first saw the keffiyeh patterned porcelain in Nation Estate, as people who just watch the films will notice, and they get, of course, entirely different meanings in the two films. So I think that this way that you're describing the shifting of context, shifting of spaces, is a way we can see your use of symbols throughout your work as well. I want to ask about then some of the symbolic elements of in vitro that are suggested by its Arabic title, Al-Mukhtabar, the laboratory. The film takes place in a kind of underground lab where plants from Bethlehem are preserved. And judging by one of Dunia's comments, so are cocoons and beehives. So maybe all the flora and fauna that the survivors of the disaster were able to hold on to. And we find out that Alia herself has been cloned from the genetic material of a previous generation. She refers to herself as one of the heirloom children, and heirloom was the title you gave to the installation that includes both the sculpture you were describing and the film. So the film must have involved a lot of research into topics like genetics, agriculture. Can you speak to the research you did for this film?
Yeah, I just a year ago, I think, I feel that I just because of the pandemic, time has completely changed. But a year ago, we published a book about the research that went into heirloom. And from me thinking that there wasn't much research to realizing I can write a whole book about the research that went into it. And yeah, because it involved a lot of these themes you're describing. I mean, I named the whole installation heirloom because in a way, heirloom can mean so many things. It can mean an inheritance of a family heirloom of an important object or a house or a farm. But it also, you speak of tomatoes as heirloom as well. So it's, it references our agriculture as well. And it was important for me to talk about it because when I started thinking about what a society that had to flee and live underground, what would it need to take with it in order to survive? So it meant a lot of the plants and seeds, and there's a lot of problems with plants and seeds in Palestine. So that is a reference to that as well, because we're slowly our heirloom seeds are disappearing for various reasons. For globalization, that was one thing, but also occupation and war. They affect agriculture in Palestine in different ways. Also the lack of water and the fact that occupation means that we are dictated where we can drill for aquifers and where we can't. And a lot of the aquifers that exist on Palestinian territory are actually now under the possession of Israel, and Palestinians are not allowed to dig under a certain amount of meters to actually reach water. So all these things affect Palestinian agriculture, affect the way Palestinians interact with their or understand their produce. I mean, when I grew up, we didn't eat from everything locally. We, ate mluchiyya from Jericho, and because Palestine has completely different climate from one area to another. We would buy fish, obviously, in Gaza or on the Mediterranean. So all these things changed when the Israeli wall was built, and we are now in Bethlehem, for example, separated from even cities as close as Jerusalem, which are 15 minutes away by car, and we cannot see water. The whole idea that we ever used to go swimming in the Mediterranean sounds like a fantasy right now. So the current generation actually don't understand Palestine as, say, even a Mediterranean country, because they never see the sea. So obviously agriculture is very different for the new generation and what they accept as the new norm. So in vitro talks about this by having a whole generation born underground. And with that also it addresses the Palestinian diaspora and diaspora in general. I think the film can be viewed in a wider context in when you think about different diasporic cultures and what it means and what the memories that are in kind of that we hold as a new generation, how much of it comes from our own memories and how much of it is something that is been told to us. So these are a lot of the topics that the film deals with, and there's been a lot of research into also epigenetics and the fact that trauma can be inherited as well, and how much of that is really a symptom of what's happening to Palestinians, how much of it is also cultural. So yeah, and I could talk forever about how much
there's so much there. I mean, in terms of the themes that the film touches on, from ecology to memory, displacement, and the effects of occupation and climate change together. I mean, the way those that converge in Palestine is something that is exceptional, but also maybe points to problems that the world as a whole is facing increasingly. So, I have so many questions around this too. Maybe I'll begin by that question of how Palestine might, point to things that are happening elsewhere too, because you always balance, in a sense, this specifically Palestinian story with a more universal one. So, in vitro, we see that the disaster that unfolds in Bethlehem has also happened elsewhere. The characters mention that whatever hit Bethlehem soon reached the rest of the world. And I'm wondering what this implies about real-world disasters that are linked to fossil fuels, for example, or the many political crises that we face as climate change accelerates, including the control of natural resources, as you describe it with water in Palestine today, or the closing of borders, whether that's the erection of a wall that encircles and takes away much of the land in the West Bank, or it's, of course, the whole US-Mexico wall animating the 2016 election and continuing in its hardening for actually decades before Trump, or just the denial of basic rights to refugees that we see around the world. So it made me think about the title of a recent book by the indigenous scholar Nick Estes, who describes the protection of water and the protest of an oil pipeline at Standing Rock on native land. And he describes it as part of a long history of indigenous resistance. The title of the book is Our History is the Future. So I wonder if your film suggests in a way that Palestinians are already facing the crises that more and more people around the world will soon face.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do find whatever happened to Palestinians is deeply traumatic, and that we've already experienced the apocalypse even before the apocalypse has hit the rest of the world. I'm very interested in the idea of anticipated memory, or the idea of stolen futures, or how do we actually, when we contextualize our present day or think about our present day in the future, what actions do we think has led to that, or how do we kind of understand the vocabulary or vernacular of our present day in the face of an imminent environmental disaster. So as we are now, we're constantly kind of talking about identities, and we're defining ourselves against the other. There's the rise of nationalism around the world is a testament to that. We're yet whatever is about, like the imminent disaster that's about to happen, is something that we, in a way, almost on a human cannot really comprehend, really, because otherwise you would think that there would be a shift to that and a concentration on saving our planet in that respect. But yeah, I do feel that all these tropes that I'm using with oil spills and of the streets of Bethlehem are obviously kind of things that we've seen so many times, of the oil and of greed, of they're just there to kind of make you understand where we're going with the film, but also they could be understood metaphorically or kind of literally. So in that sense, it does function in two different ways. But I do want to kind of frame the Palestinian question in a wider context, and then also speak about planetary memory. So if my starting point is, say, personal memory, and then discussing collective memory, and go on to discuss state memory, then framing it in planetary memory and what then all our kind of struggles mean planet-wise is something that's quite important.
And I think this comes back to what you began speaking about in terms of turning away from documentary. I mean, the way that using symbols like the sphere creates something evocative that can point to so many things. It's not a factual claim about occupation. It is something that might, for viewers, evoke memory. It might evoke, the possibilities of planetary life or galactic life in some promising way, or it might be very threatening, be about impending disaster in some way. It's an uncanny object. And when you mentioned that, unfortunately, it seems that humans can't comprehend the scale of climate change, that's something that I felt about Monument for Lost Time when I saw it. You really can't comprehend the object in the sense that you're describing because of the ultra black non-reflective paint, and there's no way to take it in. And that has a very powerful, unsettling effect on viewers, I think. And so, I guess I want to ask more about this interplay between the literal and the metaphor, and between the Palestinian and the universal, to just describe a bit with In Vitro, where the disaster, can be thought of literally as an environmental catastrophe, that hits a city and forces its survivors to adapt to a radically different life. But it also, of course, can be interpreted as an allegory, as Palestinians would probably see it, for the Palestinian condition, with the ecological disaster standing in for the Nakba in a way, and the underground bunker recalling refugee camps where Palestinians are awaiting return to their villages, and reflecting on what home means and what memories of home are. So I guess to ask this a bit differently, this question, how do you envision your audience when you're making a film like this?
I think I often I guess try to almost make my work more digestible to a Western audience. And once I stopped doing that, I actually enjoy my work much more. And I feel in recent works, I just don't do that. I just talk about things that I want to address and that I think are important for everyone. And I think the fact that I'm often seen as, say, a local or artist that talks about local problems is problematic for me, because I think what's happened, I mean, I think Palestine is central to so many of world problems. It is a responsibility on that everyone has to understand and to fix. So I don't find this, I find we are all kind of interconnected. So it's very strange for me when somebody can perceive this as a local problem, or think, or even manage to say that, well, I don't know much about the Middle East. I find that quite funny, because it's not really something that you can afford not knowing. You have to know. So in that sense, I do speak to, I feel, an international audience. But all your kind of interpretations of what the bunker could be, or, I mean, they are just things that are completely, you know, I wouldn't say, I'm open to interpretations, but I mean, obviously, the bunker could represent refugee camps, could also be a representation of the diaspora of Palestinians. It's first and foremost kind of a questioning of reality, because for the new generation, their reality is the bunker. Yet the previous generation keeps telling them that that shouldn't be their reality. It's just a corridor that ties them from the apocalypse of what happened before to the future, which is a repopulation of Earth. So the new generation, and then you see that in the film, Alia becomes very resentful of the fact that what she knows is actually is considered an exile, or she's supposed to consider it an exile, but it's actually her mother's exile and the previous generation's exile. And I think it's a rift that one can see in many cultures. But I think in the Palestinian context specifically, if you think of 1948 and the exodus of the Palestinian people, the fact that we remember this as a big injustice that was done to us, and we are living in that moment still, and thinking that one day internationally we are going to be granted a state. So I feel that the corridor is that we are living in that limbo state where we're constantly talking about the past, and we're constantly projecting into the future, and we're talking about the future Palestinian state, yet the present is slowly disappearing. And all the symbolism and signifiers that come with that trauma are significant for me, because they at some point become nothing more than just artifacts as objects in a kind of a museum. And that's what I kind of try to do in Nation State, where those objects that signify Palestinianness just start becoming repetitive tropes, rather than something that has a function or a meaning, or actually could have a play and have a role in the shaping of our identity, really, rather than being reductive. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I just feel that once we start talking about this, a lot of doors start opening. So we could take the discussion in many directions in that way.
For sure, yeah, and you also gave us the image of a corridor that could lead us down many paths. Yeah, I want to emphasize, what you're saying about time, which really is a big theme throughout your films, this idea of an empty present, and Palestinians, but maybe much of the world, again, this can be read both ways, feeling this sense of limbo, this suspension, with the past weighing very heavily and a future always anticipated, but not coming. And I think you deal very sensitively with the intergenerational conflicts around some of those questions, the ambivalence that maybe, you know, a third or fourth generation Palestinian after 1948 feels when they hear their grandparents' memories, for example, and you know, don't feel that that is a home, but it is not the home they have experienced, and so, you know, feel a burden of memory also, and a kind of ambivalence about the idea of return. And I think also you opened up that same tension around the question of national symbols. So maybe I can ask you about that a bit, how your work sort of positions nationalism and the myths of a nation, the symbols, the fictions, because, you know, there's a very powerful line in Vitro where Dunia, as she's arguing with Alia, says entire nations are built on fairy tales. And it's something also that, of course, in the future is really focused on, you know, that's a film in a way that illustrates how nations are founded and sustained through fiction, in that case, the fictions of archaeology. And at the same time, your films do show this desire for national self-determination. I mean, the astronaut, you as the astronaut, you know, planting the Palestinian flag on the moon, and also even the protagonist of In the Future does decide to create her own archaeological myth to prove the existence of her people. So she takes what she calls her ruler's strategy and she appropriates it for her own people in a way. So I wonder how you see that kind of tension around the nation, nationalism, national symbols in your work. And yeah, you know, I mean, there's one way, of course, of thinking about it in terms of Palestinians are forced to live in that tension. You know, we have suffered the history of nationalism with the British, the French, the Zionist movement sort of deciding the fate of the Levant region according to nationalist ideologies, but also as a stateless people, you can't let go of the idea of a nation state in a way. So yeah, could you speak to that tension?
Yeah, I mean, you can see it already in Space Exodus, and maybe it's not very clear, but when I step on the moon, I leave a footprint of the keffiyeh, the Palestinian headscarf that we associate with resistance. And then it became something that got stuck throughout all of my work with the Palestinian keffiyeh. In A Space Exodus, obviously I claim a piece of the moon by planting a Palestinian flag on it. I also claim a piece of the world by saying that as a Palestinian, I also can contextualize myself in a progressive way, where I launch myself into space and I take a piece of land. But also it's obviously a comment on land grabs in Palestine and on colonialism. And land grabs become a bigger comment in the future. They ate from the finest porcelain because the state of Israel has a strategy of actually creating facts on the ground by, you know, building as many settlements. It doesn't matter if it's on illegal land, but if they are to be dismantled at a later stage because it's unjust that they were built in the first place, it will create another humanitarian disaster. And therefore, creating facts on the ground is a strategy for Israelis. And I decided that the protagonist in the film will actually create facts in the ground by taking this keffiyeh symbol and almost reactivating those symbols that are so dear to Palestinians, because we are losing our land and culture, that seems like we are kind of clinging on to symbols just for, you know, for dear life. So in the film, the protagonist reactivates those symbols by burying this Palestinian DNA in the ground for future archaeologists to find. And she leads a group that call themselves narrative terrorists. And obviously, it questions how history gets told, how who writes history, and how much of it does have to be based on truth value. So, for example, the biggest fiction that Palestinians ever experienced was that Israel built a state saying that it's a land with no people, or for a people without a land. So it's already, how long does a myth have to be in place before it becomes reality? So I decided that this project of actually burying porcelain in the ground would only make sense if I actually did go to various parts of Israel and Palestine and buried that porcelain. So actually I did a performance piece afterwards where I buried those plates in 15 different locations in Israel and Palestine. And I had little Fabergé eggs that are shaped on a bomb, the nuclear Russian bomb, the first nuclear Russian bomb. And when they open, you see the coordinates of where those porcelain plates are buried. And so when they're collected by a museum, the museum role is also reversed when they start becoming not just an institution that preserves the past, but also preserves the future. So it plays on the blurry line between fact and fiction. And I think in all of nation building, for me, there is a very thin line between those concepts. And I think Palestinians have a psyche that has experienced a trauma. And in that sense, I think if you think about homogeneous time, there was a rupture that happened to Palestinians in 1948. And I guess when the film starts with the whole flooding of the city, you see that also the Nativity Church, which is the biggest symbol, again, of Bethlehem, gets demolished. And for me, it was important to actually start with demolishing all these symbols and understand what it means to have a psyche that's stuck and is in trauma, and what it means for Palestinian identity. So I think Palestinian identity is quite an important part in vitro specifically.
Mm-hmm. And also, trauma is one other place where fact and fiction collide in a way. You know, the true traumatic memory, and then also the fantasies, the dreams, the ways it affects the psyche and brings up these new kind of fictions that arise from that rupture. I want to ask you just one last question, and I'd like to ask a little more about this tension between fact and fiction that is so powerful in your work, and the way that you take that very sinister phrase, facts on the ground, and work with it. A fiction that becomes a fact through this kind of performance, and one of your literal performances here too. Fact and fiction are mentioned as well in vitro, where Dunia, after she mentions fairy tales as what nations are built on, says that facts are too sterile. And she says something to Alia that's very memorable. She says, we spent way too long registering, recording, and archiving. We failed to see that the only non-negotiable part of any argument is pathos. So I'd like to close by asking you if Dunia is voicing some of your thoughts there, some of the reasoning for why you make the kind of films you do, and what you think maybe more broadly the role of pathos and of fantasy are for Palestinian culture today.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that it's what I think, because I just think that this conversation has had to be had between those two generations. It's almost, there's a taboo in Palestinian culture of talking about the past, or kind of even criticizing the way things are, or you criticize them from a very particular way, but you cannot approach it in say the way it has been approached in vitro. So I just think that discussion needs to be had, because we do have a generational rift. Dunia wants to preserve the past because she doesn't think that starting from a clean slate is even a possibility. But that also, we could talk about, right-wing, left-wing politics, and where kind of what approaches they take when we talk about history and elimination of history or the preservation of history. So there's a lot of kind of directions one could take their interpretation to. But in terms of pathos, and I think maybe that could kind of, it relates to what I think is the problem with what is happening to the story or the narrative, the Palestinian narrative. I think that we've long been trying to kind of show evidence of the all the violations that we've experienced, but it's not. I don't think it's the evidence that we need to actually show that will bring us to the our story to or get our story to be heard. I think it's we're competing against another narrative that's more persuasive than ours, or more kind of interesting to listen to than ours. And I think it's not really, and that's why I say it doesn't. Your argument doesn't even have to be based on truth. It could be based on fiction, as long as it's interesting to listen to. So I think it's the persuasive argument that wins in the end, and that's maybe you could say that is maybe somehow what part of what I think.
Yes, that's a great note to leave on. Thank you so much for speaking with me and with our audience, Larissa. It's a pleasure to see your films and to speak with you.
Thank you very much, Karim.